Hello, everyone. Great to see everybody. Some people I haven't seen before, some people I haven't seen in a long time, so thanks for coming out. Welcome to Artful Evening. Ceramic artist Margaret Bohls makes hand-built pottery and sculptural forms that are sourced from the historical traditions of ceramics, craft, and the decorative arts. From centuries of worldwide cultures and practices comes a fascination with utilitarian objects and the relationship between vessel and maker. Her work is not simply a reproduction or an individual style, but is a contemporary interpretation and blend of formal aesthetics that reflect multiple influences: Chinese and Korean celadons, Iranian and European tin-glazed earthenware, European porcelain, and Bauhaus and Art Deco ceramics from the modern era. These influences may resonate in one of her many series. Despite the elaborate craftsmanship and attention to detail, Margaret speaks a potter's language: line, weight, volume, edge, containment, surface, scale, and touch. In addition to the numerous national and international residencies and workshops Margaret has participated in over the 40-year career, she has been ceramics faculty or professor from Nova Scotia to Sam Houston University in Texas, from Tulane University to the University of Minnesota, and from Penn State to her current home in Lincoln at the University of Nebraska. And I don't want to leave out academia, from Rhode Island School of Design to LSU for those fine art degrees. For the next 2 days, Margaret will be demonstrating her method for creating vessels in our 2026 Ceramics Department workshop entitled Using History as Inspiration. I'd like to thank the Jim and Lois Richmond Workshop Fund for their generous support bringing Margaret to Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. If you'd like to see several of Margaret's lovely pieces, they're on display in the first floor hall of the Kirk Newman Art School. And there's still room for Margaret's workshop Friday and Saturday, 9 to 5. Just talk to me afterwards if you'd like to register. Please join me in giving a warm Kalamazoo welcome to Margaret Bohls.
Thank you, Julie. That was such a nice introduction, although now I feel really old. Okay, I am a pretty informal speaker, so if anybody has any questions while I'm talking, please just raise your hand or shout it out. I'm fine with interruptions. I am going to start with my most recent body of work and then sort of go back in history after that. My current work and the basis of this workshop is what I call the Italian series. As Julie mentioned, I started out my art career at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, and during the time that I was there, I did a study abroad in Rome for 6 months, and I feel like my personal aesthetic was really formed there. I was young. I was maybe 20 years old when I went there, and I wanted to go back. The first time I was afforded a sabbatical, which was as late as 2019. So 2018, 2019, I went back to Italy, not having been there for many, many years, just to sort of see how I feel about my work in relationship to all of my visual influences and to find new influences. And so in academia, you have to sort of write a proposal about what you're going to do on if you have a new project. And so I devised this project. I really just wanted to go to Italy. So I sort of formulated my whole project around ancient Italian ceramics. And so what you're seeing is a body of work that I made in response to going to Italy and looking at as many objects from ancient Italy that were made on the Italian peninsula as I possibly could. I learned a lot while I was there. And I call this Italian studies mostly because I was studying the ceramics. This all culminated in an exhibition, and so I'll show you. This is all from an exhibition that I did at the Museum of Nebraska Art when I returned to University of Nebraska Lincoln. All of the objects were made. Some of them were made in Italy. I did a residency there, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Some of them were made once I came back. I did a lot of drawings when I was there. I took a lot of photographs. And I studied those historical ceramic objects mostly by reproducing the form. So I would draw them and I would make them. And I felt a little funny about it. At being an academic, studying is what I do, right? But also I was making this artwork without really knowing what my personal aesthetic contribution was going to be to the work. And it just sort of happened around over time. So over about a year or two when I was really working with these forms, I think part of my aesthetic contribution, the creative contributions, has to do with the objects that I chose to reproduce, right? So picking and choosing objects and juxtaposing them one against the other was part of what I was doing. I'll go back a little bit. Part of it, of course, was how I dealt with surface. You'll see when I'm talking about my earlier work that I have a real interest in Modernist era decorative arts, and so the surface information on these pieces, a lot of it sort of comes from that study of Modernist decorative arts. This is where I started in Italy. This is the Villa Giulia. And it is the National Etruscan Museum in Rome. It was once the villa of Pope Julius. It was a 16th century Roman villa that then belonged to Pope Julius III, but it's now a giant collection of Etruscan ceramics. Etruscans were in central Italy from about 700 BC to 200 BC. It was one of the earliest civilizations on the Italian peninsula, and they made everything out of clay. So the things that the Greeks were making out of stone, carving out of stone, the Etruscans were making out of clay, which is why I've always loved them. I've always been interested in them. So I did a sort of a deep dive into Etruscan ceramics when I was in Italy. And this is sort of what the displays look like. It looks very different now from when I was there in the 1980s. But the objects are the same. It's just arranged differently. And so each of these glass cases is full of the contents of someone's grave, right? And so the Etruscans would build necropolises, an entire city dedicated to the dead. Each wealthy person who died would be given an entire home. They would be buried in urns inside the home, and then they would be given everything they need for the next life, right? And so some of the objects were imported from Greece, some of them were made in Etruria. It's not really known how many of these things were for use in daily life, or whether they're reproductions that would have been used of things that would have been used in daily life that were made for the grave. But, you know, 6 1 half dozen the other. They're interesting objects, and I love sort of looking at them and trying to figure out what they were for. They were clearly utilitarian objects of different sorts. The understanding of Etruscan utility is really different, of course, than contemporary either European or American utility. But I just love looking at these objects and thinking about these were useful. I'm a firm believer that pottery teaches us how to use it, right? That the best pots have within them the information about how they are meant to be used. They're meant to communicate something. And so whether or not we understand the language is the question. And I feel like this is pottery that's in a different language from our language. So in any case, I made these objects. I'll show you a little bit about my process. This on the left is an object that is this is in a museum in Volterra. It's one of the oldest museums in Italy. It's another beautiful old villa. And then I would draw the object and then essentially reproduce it. And I did that for a long time just in order to understand the pieces. So I did that and again. So I'm just going to show you a few things that I have found and made. And, you know, I think they always say that originality is directly correlates to the obscurity of your sources, right? So I guess at my age, I'm turning 60 this year. I've been making work, as Julie said, for 40 years. That's a little hard to believe, but I am less concerned with my own originality than I am with making things that I'm interested in, right? And so I have always sort of followed my interest rather than trying to invent new things. Maybe it's because I'm an academic. These were storage jars from this. So you're seeing them here. They had a little reproduction of a tomb as it was found, right? And they put the objects in there. These are the Etruscans, like the Greeks, would have a symposium-like gathering, and a symposium is where a bunch of people get together. They recline on couches. People would eat on couches lying down. There would be these stands next to the couches that contained wine or water. They would mix the wine and the water, and then they would drink. The Greeks would drink until they were drunk, and then they would parade through the streets. I don't know what the Etruscans did. The interesting thing about Etruscans, though, is that women were present. Women were considered equals, or at least more equal in Etruscan society than in Greek society. And so the imagery of these wine drinking ceremonies or food gatherings always include women. And the graves, the sculptural sarcophagi of the Etruscans always had a man and a woman posed as equals, which I really enjoyed. Maybe that's why I got so interested in Etruscan ceramics. This one on the right is really interesting. Those are griffin heads at the top there. So you can see that the Etruscans absorbed some imagery from the Greeks, but they made pots that had a lot more sort of bare clay. They didn't do as much decorating on the surface of objects. And there's a lot of objects that I have chosen to look at and reproduce that were really specific to the Etruscan culture. So I made these 3 series of objects based on the different kinds of objects that I was looking at. So I'm just showing you some of the original objects that I really love. And you can see some decoration on here. It's very different than the kind of decoration you might find on a Greek vase, for instance. So I've been making these kinds of things over and over again for the last, I don't know, since 2019, for the last 7 years. I continue to do iterations of these objects, and I think they have become much more my own, and they have absorbed much more of my sort of personal aesthetic along the way. I think, as Julie said, I've bounced around a lot in my life. I taught at many different places, and I've moved around. I've lived in lots of different places, and I feel like the same thing with my work. My work changes for each new body of work I make. New clay body, new building methodology, new visual sources. And again, that's probably because I live and work in academia, but it's also because I'm really easily bored. This is probably the longest time I've spent on a particular body of work. Maybe I'm slowing down a little bit as I get older. So that first series, I think I just called it Etruria. And it was all based on unglazed ware from a particular time period in Etruscan society. There's another kind of ware that is called buccara ware, and it is black polished ware. They still make buccara ware in Italy these days. So the forms and form language is a little bit different than this impasto ware, which is the unglazed ware that I just was showing you. A little bit more delicate, maybe a little bit more utilitarian. The buccara ware was sort of household ware. The impasto ware was mostly found in grave sites. So again, I'm not a art history scholar. I do teach the history of ceramics, but I teach it from the perspective of a maker, and I teach it for makers and not art historians. So this is buchrowware. You can see it is fired in a reduction atmosphere, and it is highly polished with a kind of a sigillata on the surface, which is a refined slip. And the form, I guess I'm really interested in I'm assuming a lot of you are potters. Potters, yes, potters, good. And those of you who are not, just call me out if I start talking too technical of language. But there's a lot of this form language that's really different. Like Greeks were all about specific proportions, 1/3, 2/3. The visual weight of things is really different in Etruscans. They like these really attenuated tiny feet and long handles. This is known as a Nicosthenic amphora, and it's a form that was really particular to the Etruscans. The Greeks actually used to make something called a Nicosthenic amphora. Nicosthenes was the potter who made these for export to the Etrurian culture. But the Etrurians also made this form, and this one was made in Etruria, which is now Tuscany, right? Etruscans, Tuscany. Tuscany is what was Etruria. So I went straight to Tuscany. That's where I was looking at these things and making a lot of them. I was at a place called La Meridiana International School of Ceramics. If you haven't heard of it, you should look it up. It's an amazing, amazing place. It is it's about an hour outside of Florence by train. It's close to a little town called Certaldo, and it's an old farm villa, essentially, that has been converted into a pottery studio. And they teach workshops year-round there. There's a lot of Americans as well as Brits who go and teach workshops there. I love it because when I teach there, I get an international group of students. It's really amazing. They teach their classes in English, which is great. This is called a spiral amphora. It's another kind of pot that is really specific to the Etruscans. You can see that kind of double spiral on the front of it. I also just, I'm just sort of interested in these crazy forms that look crazy to me, right? Like this has such a tiny little neck and the top is so wee and the handles are so thin. And some of them have round handles, which is not a thing. As Julie said, I was in Minnesota for many years. I taught at the University of Minnesota for about 15 years before I moved to Nebraska. Minnesota has a really particular ceramics history. They call it Mingei soda, right? Mingei is the pottery movement that came out of Japan in the mid 20th century. Shoji Hamada, Bernard Leach, and the Minnesotans really took that tradition to heart. And so Minnesota pottery is really particular, and Asian pottery has had such an amazing influence on American potters. So looking at Italian, like European ceramics, is a very different thing. And so you get a whole different kind of form language, which I'm really excited about. And I just love, being a potter. I love handles and feet and spouts. And the shape of a volume, right? I'm a formalist at heart. I'm a modernist. I know that's kind of a dirty word these days, but I just love how line and shape and form can communicate. And I think pottery is a lot, as I said, pots communicate. They communicate formally. They communicate through their weight and their balance, how they feel in your hand. But they also communicate visually about what to use them for. So this is essentially what I've been doing for a while. And this is what we're going to do in our workshop. We're going to look at historical forms and we're going to riff on them in some way. The difference between these objects and the way that I make them, of course, all of these were thrown on a pottery wheel historically. I am a hand builder, so I make all of these things by pinching and coiling them. And part of that is, I came up through art school and I learned to draw. I love to draw. as you can see from my images. I feel like coil building is much more like doing a drawing of something because it's a slow, methodical process. You're slowly describing a form over a longer period of time. I think slab building's a little bit like a drawing as well. And maybe I'll talk about that a little bit later. Look at these crazy bowls. Like, look at the handles on them. These are earthenware, right? Which is a fairly fragile medium once it's fired. But they were not afraid of tall, narrow feet or really thin handles. That kind of elegance and sort of attenuation was really part of what they did. And I feel like the Mingei is all about sturdy, generous, informal pottery. They're heavy, right? These are light and thin. Yes. It's a good question. What I don't know is what kinds of households these came out of. One would assume that they were probably higher, more wealthy families. But this bucro-ware was wheel thrown, and you go to this museum. It's called what is it called? It'll come to me. These are from that museum in Volterra. And there's just case after case after case of similar forms. So there's hundreds of them, right? It makes you think that most households had something like this and that this is what they ate out of. Clay is definitely less expensive than metal. Metal was the valued kind of material to have for plates and cups and bowls, right? So clay was a cheap alternative to that. So I would assume that most people were able to afford these kinds of pots. But I think is anybody Italian in here? Italians, you go to Italy and you get the understanding that their priorities are beauty, things that look beautiful, things that taste amazing. They're all about giving themselves time to appreciate beautiful things. When you eat, you sit down for a couple hours. And there's courses, and you eat slowly. And even at a country table, there's ceremony that goes around eating. And so I think that kind of explains a little bit about the pottery in some way. So these are my first interpretations of these forms. And then the thing that I discovered, so I went to Italy and then I spent a couple weeks in London at the British Museum and at the Victoria and Albert Museum because of colonialism. The British have all kinds of objects from everywhere around the world. And so not that I love what colonialism has done to our world. I love that all of those things are amassed in one collection and I can sort of go look at them and study from them. And I learned about here and also in the Italian museums that I was visiting. Also, if anybody thinks they're going to go to Italy, let me know and I can give you a list of great places to look at clay things. I learned about the Apulians. So Apulia is the heel of the boot, right? That whole area, there was another culture at the same time as the Etruscans that has completely different form language, completely different decorative imagery. So this sort of set here, it comes from Apulian ceramics. I don't know, and they're not as, I don't think that there's not as much scholarship about the ancient Apulians, although you can see from their surfaces that they have a relationship to the Greek geometric pots, the early Greek pots. They're called geometric because they have all of this geometric decoration on the surface of them. But the Apulians have a lot of animal imagery, or maybe sort of human/animal imagery on the surface of their pieces. This is a duck ascos, and the Greeks made duck ascos. The Etruscans made duck ascoi. This is a really unusual version of it. That's my studio at home. I'm not following my notes at all. I'm just looking at them. I think this is all sort of, all of this, the Etruscans and the Apulians are working around the same time as the early parts of the Greek civilization. And I love that there is such a variety. When you look at classical Greek ceramics, there's codified ways in which you make different sorts of forms. The further you get away from Greece, those kinds of forms get sort of riffed on in an interesting way. And then, of course, there's also forms that are really particular to a particular culture. So, I mean, look at these forms. This is probably meant for pouring. Looks like a mug, right? It's probably a pouring pot, but it's about the size of a mug. And on the top of the handle, it has this little effigy, this little pointy, what is kind of like a pointy head. So I'm just showing you what I've made and what I looked at. Florence has a really great archaeological museum as well, and they happen to have a show that included a lot of Apulian ceramics when I was there in 2019, maybe 2018, I can't remember, right before the pandemic. This is a great form. They call it a spittoon. Kind of looks like a spittoon. Maybe it is a spittoon. I don't know exactly what it was for, but I love these little, I have a pointer. I love this. It looks like kind of like a cat or an animal. It has ears, right? And you see this kind of form abstracted over and over again. You can see that the handle also has two little points there. And here, right here, is another sort of vertical. Sometimes it looks like a hand, like a human hand. Sometimes it looks like the head of an animal. And then they make these lovely, these are probably ladles, right? I call it an effigy ladle because it has this female figure on it. There's her boobs right there. Those are eyes. And then you can see here, look, it looks abstracted, but it has really a similar sort of look to it. So clearly this is referencing something like this, or maybe the sort of animal effigy that was on those other forms. I can geek out about this kind of thing. I don't know how super interesting it is to other people, but maybe you're interested in the process though, finding your own visual imagery and incorporating it into your work. I just love this process of looking and drawing and making, and then inventing surface. You know, I've come to believe after teaching ceramics for about way too long, 30 years I've been teaching at the university, that really ceramics, you know, back in the mid 20th century, late 20th century, there's this whole debate about, is ceramics craft or art, right? And I would just say it can be either. I think of myself as a craftsperson, and I think the core of craft is process, material, and history, right? Those are the essences of what we do. These are called trozzella, or an individual object is called a trozzella. It's only made right in this region, Apulia. There was several cultures there. There was the Piutetians or Piusetians, the Daunians, and one other, the Messapians, and they were in this sort of region together. Each of them had their distinct imagery. These are from the Messapian culture, and they have these kind of spool-like handles. And then you can see maybe here, I haven't really looked a whole lot at this, but they also had this more elaborate, more realistic sort of human imagery with these crazy costumes on. There's my studio at home again. Okay, so that's that series of work. I also, you know, again, I make individual objects now, and I'm seeing how you know, whether I can get people to use these things. They're not the most self-explanatory or utilitarian of objects, but I've been making them. I glaze the inside. I make them, you know, food safe, et cetera, and I've been selling them as individual objects. And, you know, I'm just sort of seeing I feel like it's interesting to have an object that you have to kind of build a relationship with and sort of figure out how to use. And maybe because I've been in ceramics for so long, I love those objects that I have in my house that are not your typical object, that you have to sort of keep your brain turned on when you're using, right? The ones that you really have to look at and pay attention to and negotiate with when you're using them. And so I feel like these are those kinds of forms. Yeah, so my hope is in that introducing these to a contemporary audience, that people sort of broaden their ideas about what is utility, right? Okay, so I'll show you briefly, I know I'm going on a bit, but I will show you briefly the Modernist series. This is the last series that I made before the Italian series, and I think you'll sort of see why they ended up in these big sort of groupings on these oval tables. Because in the Modernist series, I was making these big oval trays. I was really studying the European history of, I'll go back just a little bit, of chocolate, coffee, and tea. And Europeans developed these coffee and tea sets. The original ones, of course, were really highly decorative. They were sort of symbols of wealth, right? And they were symbols of colonialism, because coffee and tea and chocolate all came from different parts of the colonial world. So I'm interested in that history. I'm interested in how those, that both food and beverages sort of got absorbed into European culture, and then of course American culture. I'm interested in all of that. So the other thing about the modern era is there was this sort of rejection of ornament during the modernist era, and everything sort of got boiled down to essential shapes and forms. And so I'm interested in that as well. I'll show you some of my sources for this work. For some reason, this one thing is on a timer. These are from the Bauhaus, from the German Bauhaus. The potters that were going to become designers for industry is what the Bauhaus was all about. But the people who wanted to make ceramics for industry had to go and learn how to make pots. They learned how to make glazes, they made their clay, they learned how to throw on the wheel, and they developed these models for objects that could be mold made and assembled. So the objects have a really particular form and form language. So I'm interested in all kinds of, like, the Art Deco, Art Nouveau, Bauhaus, different movements in that area. These are objects that were designed by Eva Zeisel. Sorry, again, they're on a timer. These are porcelain or some sort of white clay with luster on the surface of them. And so, just trying to write, so here's another one of my sets, and I'll show you the original visual sources. This is a set of objects called Samarkand or Arabesque. Samarkand is a particular location in the Middle East where pottery was produced. These are British objects that were taking visual language from Islamic pottery. And I understand that they're a little bit hideous, right? I'm interested in the idea that they're kind of weird and ugly. They're not at all as beautiful as Islamic pottery, right? But they have, I feel like they really speak of their own era. This was produced in, let's see, mid-20th century. So I think these are like 1950s or 1960s. Samarkand is a city in Uzbekistan. It was a center for the production of Islamic pottery in around the 10th century CE. So I saw these, and I was especially interested in these coffee pots that's sort of squaring off of things. And so I made this first, and then I made that. And now I'm making things like this that come from that set. So things change a little bit as I continue making them. This comes from looking at a really particular Rosenthal coffee pot. And I wanted these objects to be oversized, so they're much bigger than ordinary functional objects. They're made out of this dark clay. I pinch them. You can see all my finger marks in them. They're big, they're heavy. I want them to be about material and materiality. I want you to understand that the clay is clay and the glaze is glaze. And I feel like that kind of has everything to do with the idea that many of the original objects that I was looking at were silver, and they were all about the silverness of silver. They were super shiny, they were clean, they were brilliant, they were beautiful. So I wanted to interpret them into clay and have them sort of be all about clay. And then these are the objects that sort of came from this. So the other thing is I think that not only can ceramics be art or craft, it can be design. There's a lot of, I feel like the wonderful thing about the field of ceramics is there's so many different ways to enter into it, and there's so many different ways to go. And I like these different sort of styles that I've developed. I love just sort of taking a single set of visual information and spreading it out to cup, to plate, to bowl, to butter dish, to think, what are the essential parts of what are the essential design elements of this object? How do they move from object to object? And how do they become sort of a set or a family of objects? And then this is from this. This is a silver Art Nouveau tea and coffee service, 1907. So more closer to early modernism, not mid-century modernism. And I'm just really interested in how the weight sits at the bottom of those objects, but how the feet elevate them. And so I began making objects that sort of mimic those shapes and forms. This is a glaze that just has a lot of metal in it. And then I also make these in this kind of greeny color. This is a much more utilitarian. This stuff is toxic. You cannot, it has all kinds of manganese in it, and you probably don't want to use it every day. But this is much more functional. So as you can see, and I still make these objects, I still make this sort of work as well when I sit down to make pots. I'm ready for my next adventure though, so if anybody has any ideas, let me know. I hope to apply for another sabbatical next year for the following year. I don't know where I'm going to go or what I'm going to make. So this kind of ginkgo tea set, I have a story about this, and I'm going to brag a little bit. Garth Johnson is the curator of ceramics at the Everson Museum in upstate New York. He happens to be an alumni of the University of Nebraska program. He was never my student. He's probably about my age, but they have the famous scarab vase, which is my pin here. The Adelaide Robineau scarab vase. It's one of the most famous sort of ceramic vases that came out of the United States. He put together a show about Adelaide Robineau built around this scarab vase that the Everson owns. And he put this piece into that show. And then he bought it for the museum. So I feel like after being of course, I'm a huge, huge fan of the scarab vase. I love modernism. I love Adelaide Robineau. And I feel like I don't have to do anything else in my career now because I've reached the top. It looks a lot greener here than it does on my screen. It's not quite this yellow. But that came from this, which is another Art Nouveau era silver tea set, European silver tea set. And then this is unglazed, clearly, but that came from this. Nobody knows where this came from. I've done as much research as I can on this. I haven't talked to any experts, which is what I probably should do, but I just love that sugar jar. And that gave me the idea to start this series of work. So that became this. I think the reason I'm not showing you the glazed version of this is because it's just really ugly. But this is what I'm making now, based sort of riffing on that series of work. And then I'll just, I know I've been going on a little bit longer, it's 6:42. I'll just show you a few things from before the Modernist series. This is what I was making. I think I stopped making this work right around 2013 or 14. This is porcelain, slab-built porcelain, except that little stand is earthenware. And I was looking again at European, earlier, like 18th and 19th century European porcelain when I began making this work. So, and before that, I was a soda fire. I mean, I've just done all kinds of things. So I don't know, maybe I'm ready to slow down and continue with what I'm making. Maybe I'll just switch gears and do something entirely different next. This, I went to, my first ceramics teacher was Jackie Rice, who taught at RISD when I was there. She was an amazing teacher. She stopped doing clay, I think after I graduated, maybe a decade after I graduated, and now designs fabric and does textiles. But they invited me back to RISD to give an image lecture, and she was like, "Oh, look at that. What do you call that? Bumpy ware?" She had a really raspy voice. She used to say, "If it's brown, flush it down." She was not about brown pots. This was the 80s, right? And then alongside this work, I was also making this and thinking about still mid-century design. I think all of this work sort of came from that, that affection for mid-century design ceramics like Russell Wright, Ava Zeisel. And it was also a very different, like these are really quick and easy to make, and they're all sort of about not touching them too much and doing something quickly and easily and confidently. And these are just fussy, right? Take a long time, process, like step by step, many, many steps. These are made very quickly and easily. So it was good for me to sort of go back and forth between those two kinds of work. I haven't made this stuff in a long time. All right, that's it. That's all I have for you. These were fired, all of this work, this earlier work, porcelain was fired to cone 9 or cone 10 in an electric kiln. All of this stuff, pretty much everything, the Modernist ware and the Modernist ware started out as cone 9, 10 and porcelain, but I quickly realized that this is not the way to work with porcelain. And so I switched to stoneware for the coil building, just because I was just fighting with the material a little too much when I was working with porcelain. And I also really wanted it to have that sort of stoneware heaviness to it. So this is all, I started cone 9, but I switched down to cone 6 because it was just easier on my electric kiln. So pretty much all of these glazes are cone 6 glazes. I do have a black clay. That black clay that is, here, let me see if I can find the, this stuff. That's a Laguna clay and that's just the clay body. It's black in an electric kiln, which is amazing for you techies. And it really only likes to go to cone 5. You fire it too hot and it'll bloat and dunt, just because it has so much iron in it. That's why it's so black. Any other questions about techie or otherwise? History, techie, process, material, Italy? Yes.
Can you just talk about like your surface design and what brought you to this specific type of surface design and black and white works?
I'm pretty literal, and I'm not, I've always wanted to be a decorator. I really admire people like Linda Arbuckle, who has the most amazing brushwork. She does Maiolica work. I love people who can decorate, and I've always wanted to do that, but I'm just not good at it. As you can see from the drawings that I showed you, I really think about everything in terms of line and edge. And so when I was looking at these and trying, I didn't want to interrupt the form too much. I just wanted to sort of reiterate and emphasize the form. And so, and also when these are together in a group, let me see if I can find the setting of them. Here we go. The lines, like if the lines kind of line up with one another, right? It's sort of like a dimensional grid. So if you look one way, all of the lines line up this way. If you look down the long end of the table, all the lines kind of line up that way. And the circles are really just emphasizing the shape of the volume, really. That's mostly what that's about.
Is that a glaze? Is the white a glaze?
The white is a glaze. Yeah, the white is a glaze. The black is just clay. At first I didn't even glaze the insides of these, but now I do. I glaze the insides with just a shiny black glaze. The white, I have one glaze that I get a lot of mileage out of. It's a white glaze that foams a little bit on this black clay body. The black clay body gasses out a lot, and so the glaze gets a little foamy, sort of like a mid-century, like a Lucy Ree kind of glaze.
Was that the spots then on that other series?
Yes. So, and here, it does something different here. I don't know if you can see these close up, but the white has it just looks like puffy paint kind of. But if you put it on this black clay, this is on an black underglaze, and so it smooths out a little bit. You can see it still bubbles and the black comes through. And if you fire it and refire it, the black comes through a little bit more. I've actually changed, let's see here, the later pieces that look like that. This is a different clay body that is grittier and has more grog in it. And so when I fire it, I get more of that black speckly when I fire that white glaze on it. So the glaze itself is pretty simple, although it has lithium in it. I don't know if you guys know what's going on with lithium, but man, oh man, is it expensive. $75 a pound now. Yeah, it's just a matte glaze that has a little bit of spodumene in it, the lithium. I got it from Richard Burkett.
Are you still using the lithium?
Yeah, until I run out of spodumene. I mean, I don't know. I feel like I don't know. We'll see. It doesn't have a lot in there. Maybe I can keep using it. But it's a really beautiful glaze. It's matte, but it moves. It's a matte glaze that moves, which I really like. And it really reacts. It really reacts with whatever's underneath it. So it just looks really different on each different clay body. And so I've tried it with colorants in it. It just doesn't, it's not as beautiful. I just like the white. And so I've used it on almost all of this work. All right, well, thank you so much for coming.